The rain had turned the city into a maze of reflective puddles, amplifying the eerie silence that hung in the air. Detective Maya Hayes parked her car at the edge of the cordoned-off crime scene. Her footsteps splashed lightly against the wet pavement as she approached the old apartment building where the latest murder had taken place. Inside, the air was heavy with the metallic scent of blood and a faint undertone of something acrid, like paint or varnish. The victim, a young woman in her mid-20s, was posed in the center of the room. Around her lay an unsettling collection of canvases. Each painting was a lifelike portrait of the victim, tears streaking her face in haunting detail. Maya crouched to examine one of the paintings. The strokes were impossibly intricate, capturing every nuance of sorrow on the woman's face. She shivered despite herself. It wasn't just the realism, it was the emotion emanating from the image. The tears looked so real. Detective Hayes, a voice called from behind. Forensics specialist Cole Donovan held up an evidence bag containing a folded piece of paper. This was left at the scene. Maya took the note and read the scrawled handwriting aloud. True beauty lies in grief. Only in sorrow are we eternal. The collector, her stomach tightened. This isn't their first, she murmured. Donovan nodded. 2 similar cases in the past 6 months. Same signature, same medium. Maya hesitated. She glanced back at the portraits, her gaze lingering on one that seemed oddly familiar. It tugged at a memory, blurry and just out of reach. As she left the crime scene, the feeling of being watched prickled her skin. She turned quickly, but the street beyond the caution tape was empty. Just the faint flicker of a shadow disappearing into the rain. The old case files lay scattered across Maya's desk, their contents illuminated by the harsh glow of her desk lamp. The clock ticked past midnight, but she couldn't stop. The collector's chilling note replayed in her mind, its cryptic words a taunt she couldn't ignore. Flipping through a file, Maya's breath hitched. The 2 prior victims had been killed months apart, each surrounded by similar portraits. Their faces, too, were streaked with tears, eerily lifelike, as if captured from the victims themselves. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion creeping in. It wasn't just the horror of the cases, it was the undercurrent of familiarity. She pulled out her personal journal, where she had recorded every detail of Emily's disappearance. Emily, her daughter, had vanished 3 years ago. The police had exhausted every lead, but Maya refused to give up. She stared at a photo clipped to the journal. Emily, smiling at a family picnic. Her fingers traced the image as tears welled in her eyes. Her phone buzzed, shattering the silence. She grabbed it and answered. "Hayes, there's been another one," Donovan said. "You need to come down here." The crime scene was a park on the edge of town. Maya's stomach churned as she approached. The body of a young woman lay under the flickering glow of a streetlight. Around her were the now familiar tear-streaked paintings. But one detail stopped Maya cold. One of the portraits didn't depict the victim. It showed a young girl, Emily. The resemblance was unmistakable, from the dimple in her chin to the soft curls framing her face. Maya's heart pounded. Was this a coincidence? Or was Emily somehow part of the collector's twisted game? Maya couldn't shake the image of the portrait. It haunted her as she drove home, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Was this the collector's way of mocking her? Or was there a connection she had missed all along? The next morning, she opened her mailbox and froze. Inside was a slim package wrapped in plain brown paper. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. A half-finished painting of her own face stared back at her. The likeness was uncanny, the expression raw and pained. Tears were smeared across the canvas, as though the artist had been interrupted. Beneath it lay a note. "Your grief is a masterpiece. Let me immortalize it." Maya's breath hitched. The collector wasn't just targeting random victims. He was targeting her. Desperate for answers, she spent the day interviewing the families of past victims. Patterns began to emerge. Each victim had endured deep personal loss. Unresolved grief was the thread connecting them all. The collector seemed to view their pain as art to be preserved. But why Emily? The question gnawed at her. What had tied her daughter to this monster? As night fell, Maya received another call. Her ex-husband, Derek, hadn't shown up for work. Frustration bubbled as she dialed his number, but there was no answer. Their relationship had been strained since Emily's disappearance, but his absence now felt ominous. Returning to her desk, Maya pulled out the unfinished painting. Her reflection in the canvas seemed to mock her. The fear, the guilt, it all felt overwhelming. She clenched her fists. If the collector wanted her grief, he would soon find out she wasn't a passive victim. The gallery was tucked away in the city's abandoned industrial district. It looked derelict from the outside, but inside, it was a macabre sanctuary. Maya's flashlight swept across the walls, illuminating dozens of portraits. Tears glistened on each one, lifelike and shimmering. They stared down at her, frozen in their final moments of sorrow. "Welcome, detective." The voice sent a chill down her spine. Maya turned to see Elias Gray, the gallery's eccentric curator. His sharp features were lit by a single spotlight, casting his shadow long and menacing. "You found my collection," he said, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Elias Gray," Maya said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "The collector." Elias's eyes gleamed. "You've done your homework. Tell me, detective, do you see it? The beauty in their grief, the raw, unfiltered truth." Maya's hand hovered near her gun. "You're sick. These are people's lives, not your canvas." Elias chuckled. "Lives are fleeting. Emotions are eternal. Your daughter understood that. Emily's tears were the first to inspire me." Maya's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Elias tilted his head. "Ah, the mother's love. So powerful, so tragic. But you'll have to see for yourself." Before she could react, a trapdoor sprung open beneath her feet. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her side. When she looked up, Elias was gone, and she was alone in the dark. Maya tracked Elias to his mansion, a sprawling, decaying structure on the city's outskirts. The air inside was damp and suffocating, filled with the faint smell of paint and turpentine. The first room she entered was a studio, cluttered with canvases and supplies. Her stomach turned as she recognized the faces of victims on half-finished portraits. Then, in the corner, she saw it, a small bed and a set of children's art supplies. "Emily," she whispered. A door creaked behind her. She spun around to find Elias, holding a blade. "She was my greatest creation," he said. "But you, Maya, you're the masterpiece." Maya lunged at him, narrowly avoiding the knife. The chase led them deeper into the mansion, through halls lined with grotesque artwork. Each painting seemed to watch her, their tear-streaked faces silently pleading for justice. Finally, she burst into a locked room and froze. Emily was there, sitting at a desk, her face pale and emotionless. She was painting. "Mom." Emily's voice was soft, hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if the woman before her was real. Before Maya could respond, Elias appeared behind her. "You can save her," he said, his tone almost tender. "But only if you let me go." Maya's hand hovered over her holstered gun, her mind racing. The moment hung in the air like a taut string. Maya's gaze flicked between Elias and Emily. "No deal," she said, drawing her gun. Elias lunged, but Maya fired, the shot echoing through the room. He stumbled back, his knife clattering to the floor. Maya rushed to Emily, pulling her close as Elias crumpled to the ground. "You're safe now," Maya whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Flames erupted as Elias, with his last breath, knocked over a lamp. The fire spread quickly, consuming his precious paintings. Maya carried Emily out of the inferno, coughing as smoke filled the air. They collapsed outside, watching the mansion burn. Days later, Maya sat with Emily in their small apartment. Emily was quiet, distant, her eyes betraying the trauma she'd endured. On the coffee table sat a single painting salvaged from the fire. It was a portrait of Maya, titled "Grief Eternal." The tear stains were fresh, as if the painting itself wept. Maya turned it face down and wrapped an arm around her daughter. "We'll heal," she said softly. But deep down, She wasn't sure if they ever truly could. The phone rang just as Sarah Langley was about to drift off to sleep. The sharp sound cut through the quiet of her dimly lit bedroom. Groaning, she reached for her phone on the nightstand, her hand trembling slightly. Since her son Josh's death 6 months ago, nights had been the hardest. She glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello." Her voice was groggy, almost annoyed. "Mom, it's me. It's Josh. Please help me." Sarah sat up so fast her head spun. She gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding. "Josh, how is this?" "I don't have time, Mom. They've got me. The voice broke off, replaced by the sound of static. Josh, where are you?" she yelled, her voice cracking. There was no response, just an eerie silence. Fingers trembling, she dialed the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again, before finally dropping the phone onto her lap. Her mind raced. It couldn't have been him. It wasn't possible. Yet the voice was so familiar, so unmistakably her son's. The next morning, Sarah went to the police. Detective Daniel Hart listened patiently as she explained the strange call, but his expression darkened when she finished. "You're not the first person to report something like this," he said gravely. "We've had cases of people receiving calls from loved ones who aren't alive anymore." Her stomach dropped. "What are you saying? That someone's copying him?" Daniel nodded. "We think it's a killer. Someone who lures people using familiar voices. We're calling him the Whisper Man." Sarah's world tilted as the weight of his words settled in. Sarah sat in her car outside the police station, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The Whisper Man. The phrase churned in her mind, twisting her grief into something colder, sharper. She thought about Josh's voice on the phone. How desperate he had sounded. It couldn't have been him, but it had to be. She drove home on autopilot, the world around her a blur. Once inside, she pulled out the old photo album she hadn't dared touch since the funeral. Pictures of Josh as a baby, a toddler, then a lanky teenager smiled up at her. But it was the last photo that made her chest tighten. Josh at 17, wearing his football jersey, his wide grin full of hope. The last time she saw him alive, they'd fought. He'd stormed out, slammed the door, and hours later, she'd received the call about the accident. A sharp knock on the door startled her. She opened it to find Detective Hart. "I thought you might need this," he said, holding out a slim file. "What is it?" "Details on the other cases." He hesitated. "I'm not supposed to share this, but I figured you'd look into it anyway." Sarah didn't wait for him to change his mind. She took the file and shut the door behind him. Inside, she found reports of 3 victims who had all received similar calls. Each had been lured out to remote locations by voices of deceased loved ones. All were found dead within days. Her phone buzzed and her breath caught. Another unknown number. She answered hesitantly. "Hello, Mom." The voice cracked with fear. "I'm still here. Please find me." "Josh," she cried. "Tell me where you are." "By the water," he whispered, and the line went dead. The abandoned warehouse reeked of mildew and despair. Sarah stepped cautiously through the broken doorway, clutching a flashlight. Josh's voice had said, "By the water," and after scouring old maps, this warehouse near the docks seemed like the best place to start. The interior was dark and cavernous, with puddles scattered across the floor from a leaky roof. As her flashlight beam swept over the room, it caught on something shiny, a small silver locket. She knelt to pick it up, her heart pounding. She recognized it instantly. It belonged to one of the Whisper Man's known victims, a young woman named Lauren Pierce. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. She wasn't alone here. Her phone buzzed. She nearly dropped it as she fumbled to answer. "Mom." Josh's voice came through, faint but clear. "Josh, I'm here," she whispered. "Where are you?" "I'm scared," he said, his voice breaking. "He's coming." "Who's coming?" Josh, talk to me. But the call ended abruptly. Her flashlight flickered, and she whipped around, certain she'd seen movement in the shadows. Hello, she called, her voice shaking. Silence answered her. She stumbled back toward the exit, but stopped when she noticed a small table by the wall. On it was a recorder, still running. She pressed play, and her own voice filled the air. Josh, talk to me. Josh. Her stomach turned as the realization hit. The Whisper Man had been recording her. As she fled the warehouse, she caught sight of a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room, watching her. Sarah's hands shook as she pored over the file Detective Hart had given her. The Whisper Man didn't just mimic voices. He studied his victims for weeks, even months, learning their habits and vulnerabilities. It wasn't random. He picked people like her, grieving, broken, desperate. She needed help. That's when she found the name, buried deep in an online forum about unsolved murders. Evan Foster, a private investigator who had spent years tracking the Whisper Man. Evan's office was a cluttered mess of papers and conspiracy boards. He gestured for her to sit, his weathered face tight with caution. You're not the first to come looking for answers, he said. The Whisper Man preys on guilt. He knows how to twist it into his greatest weapon. Sarah leaned forward. But how does he do it? How does he sound so real? Evan hesitated, then pulled out a small device. Voice modulators. High-tech. Military grade. But it's more than that. He's the chameleon. He doesn't just copy voices. He understands the people behind them. Before she could press further, Evan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and froze. What is it? Sarah asked. He turned the screen toward her. It was a voice message. From her. Evan, he's here. Please help me. They both bolted for the door. But it was too late. Hours later, Sarah saw the news. Evan Foster had been found dead, his phone clutched in his hand. Her phone rang again that night. Josh, where are you? She pleaded. I'm waiting for you, he whispered. Come find me. The cabin stood deep in the woods, shrouded in mist. Sarah parked at the edge of the dirt road and approached cautiously, every step echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood and something sharper, paint, maybe varnish. She descended into the basement and froze. The walls were plastered with photos of the Whisper Man's victims. Some she recognized from the case files, others were strangers. And there, in the center of the wall, was a photo of Josh. Do you like it? The voice came from behind her, calm and almost conversational. She spun around to face a man in his 40s, with sandy brown hair and a nondescript face. His expression was polite, almost kind. I've been waiting to meet you, Sarah. She reached for her phone to call for help, but he tooted softly. Now, he said, stepping closer. That won't do. Let's talk. Mother to mother. Mother, she stammered. He tilted his head, his voice shifting seamlessly to mimic Josh's. You've been so strong, Mom. But you let me down, didn't you? Her knees nearly buckled as the words cut into her. The Whisper Man's smile widened. You see, guilt is such a beautiful thing. It binds us, controls us. Before he could move closer, the door burst open. Detective Hart stood there, gun drawn. Sarah, get out of here. The Whisper Man's calm demeanor cracked, and in the chaos, he bolted into the woods, leaving behind a chilling laugh. Sarah and Hart stood in the shadows of the abandoned factory, waiting. The plan was simple. Use Sarah as bait to lure the Whisper Man out. Her phone buzzed. Mom, Josh's voice again. But this time, she was ready. I'm here, Josh, she said, forcing her voice to steady. Come find me. The Whisper Man emerged from the darkness, his face calm but his eyes gleaming with malice. You're even more remarkable in person, he said, his voice soft. But you don't have to suffer anymore. Let me take the pain away. You don't know me, Sarah said, her voice rising. Oh, but I do. His tone shifted, mimicking Josh's voice perfectly. You made me who I am. Something inside Sarah snapped. She lunged forward, catching him off guard, and Hart seized the moment to tackle him. The struggle was brief but brutal. The Whisper Man lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him, his last words spoken in Josh's voice. were a chilling whisper. You'll never stop listening. Weeks later, Sarah sat alone in her home. The calls had stopped, and the whisper man was gone. But as the night deepened, she swore she heard Josh's voice again. Soft, distant, calling from the shadows. Sophia Hale adjusted the hem of the elegant, emerald green dress she had purchased just days ago. It clung perfectly to her frame, the silk fabric shimmering under the chandelier's light as she navigated the crowded gala. It had been an impulse buy, one of those rare moments when she allowed herself something beautiful. As the evening wore on, she slipped away from the main hall, seeking a quiet corner. Her fingers grazed the fabric absent-mindedly, and she noticed something odd, a small, inconspicuous bulge near her hip. Curious, she stepped into a secluded lounge and searched for a pocket. Finding a nearly invisible seam, she slid her fingers inside and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. The edges were frayed, the ink faint. Please help me. My name is Annalise. He keeps us in the seams. Sophia's breath hitched. Her first instinct was disbelief. A prank. An old note someone had forgotten. But the handwriting felt desperate, the words frantic. She spent the rest of the evening distracted, clutching the note in her purse. By the time she returned home, the dress no longer felt elegant. It felt oppressive. In the safety of her small apartment, she examined the dress more closely. The seams were meticulous, almost impossibly intricate, as if the stitches held secrets. Her mind churned with questions. The next day, she returned to the boutique where she had bought the dress. The shop owner, a woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile, barely reacted when Sophia mentioned the note. This dress, who made it? Sophia pressed. The owner hesitated. Elias Grayson, a recluse, but brilliant. His pieces are rare. You're lucky to have one. But as Sophia left the shop, the lingering unease in her chest told her otherwise. Sophia spent the night scouring the internet for any mention of Elias Grayson. His name yielded sparse results. A few fashion pieces in private collections, a short biography stating he was once a rising star in haute couture before retreating from the spotlight. But one thread caught her attention. It was buried in a forgotten forum, under the title, The Stitcher of Shadows. The post described strange rumors surrounding Grayson's creations, garments associated with disappearances. The last line sent a chill through her. His work carries pieces of the lost. The next morning, she returned to the boutique, hoping to pry more information from the owner. Where does Grayson work? Does he take commissions? The woman shook her head. No one sees him anymore. He sends his work to select shops. That's all I know. Sophia wasn't convinced. As she left, her gaze caught on a dark sedan parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, but she felt the weight of unseen eyes. At home, she unfolded the note from the dress and smoothed its frayed edges. My name is Annalise, it read. She typed the name into a search engine. A missing persons report popped up almost immediately. Annalise Mayer, last seen 3 years ago. The photo was grainy, but the face was unmistakable. Sophia's chest tightened. She shut the laptop and sat in the quiet, memories rising unbidden. Her own sister, Rebecca, had disappeared when they were teenagers. For years, she tried to find her, only to hit dead ends. The pain still lingered. Raw wounds she avoided touching. That night, as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Do not look further. Her pulse quickened. Someone new. The second-hand store smelled of mothballs and thyme, the air thick with dust. Sophia combed through racks of clothing, her fingers brushing against fabrics that seemed ordinary. She almost missed it. A crimson blouse with seams so fine they seemed woven by a machine. A shiver ran down her spine as she examined it. Her fingers found another hidden pocket. Inside was a photograph, a young woman with a somber expression, her name scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting, Annalise. Sophia stared at the image, her unease growing. Why had she been drawn into this? And why did Grayson's work feel tied to something more sinister? She brought the blouse to the counter. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with milky eyes, hesitated before ringing it up. "This piece, it's one of his," he murmured. "People don't keep them for long." "What do you mean?" The man leaned closer. "They say his garments remember things, carry pieces of the people they belong to." Sophia left the shop with the blouse, but couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she walked to her car, the sedan from the previous day idled nearby. At home, she laid out the photograph and note side by side. They felt like pieces of a puzzle she didn't understand. Her phone buzzed again. "You've been warned." Sophia's hands trembled. She had been careful, but someone was following her every move. That night, she dreamed of Rebecca. Her sister stood in the shadows, silent and distant. When Sophia called out, Rebecca turned, her expression haunted. "It's in the seams," she whispered before vanishing. Sophia woke with a start, the words echoing in her mind. Sophia found Elias Grayson's studio in a forgotten part of the city, hidden behind ivy-covered gates. The building loomed, its windows dark and uninviting. She hesitated at the door, but pushed forward. The inside was meticulously organized, every bolt of fabric and spool of thread in its place. A mannequin stood in the center, draped in an unfinished gown. "Admiring my work?" The voice startled her. Elias stepped out of the shadows, a tall man with silvering hair and an unervingly calm demeanor. His dark eyes scanned her with curiosity. "You're bold to come here," he said, his voice silky. Sophia held up the note and photograph. "What are these? What are you doing to people?" He smiled faintly. "I create beauty. My work preserves memories." She followed his gaze to a wall of bolts, each labeled with a name. Her breath caught when she saw Rebecca's among them. "What is this?" "Every thread tells a story," Elias said. "I simply ensure it isn't forgotten." Sophia's rage boiled over. "You're using people's lives for your art." Elias's face darkened. "Their grief, their essence, it's eternal. And you wear it beautifully." Sophia's hand brushed against the dress she wore, suddenly feeling its weight. Her pulse quickened as she backed away. "You've come too far, Sophia," he said, stepping closer. Before she could respond, he disappeared into the labyrinth of fabric, leaving her surrounded by the whispers of unseen voices. Sophia wandered through the studio's twisting halls, the eerie stillness broken only by the rustle of fabric. Every mannequin seemed to watch her, their blank faces unsettlingly lifelike. She found a ledger on a nearby table, its pages filled with names and descriptions. Each entry detailed a missing person and the garment they had become. Her sister's name was there, next to the word "finished." Her stomach churned as she moved deeper into the studio. In a back room, she found mannequins draped in completed pieces. One wore a dress she recognized from an old photo of Rebecca. The door creaked behind her. Elias stood there, holding a pair of shears. "You don't understand," he said. "This is my gift to the world." Sophia backed away, her eyes darting to an open window. "You're insane." He advanced, his expression calm, but his movements deliberate. "You think grief should fade? I make it eternal." She grabbed a spool of thread from the table and hurled it at him, using the distraction to dash past him into the main hall. The studio felt like a maze, the walls closing in as she ran. The whispers grew louder, the air thick with their presence. Elias's footsteps echoed behind her, slow and steady. She burst into the main room, grabbing a lantern from a table. Her hands shook as she turned back, ready to face him. Elias stepped into the room, his calm facade finally breaking. His voice, usually measured, now carried an edge. "You can't destroy what I've created." Sophia raised the lantern. "Watch me." With a swing, she smashed it against the wall, sending flames licking up the fabric bolts. The fire spread quickly, consuming his precious creations. "No." Elias lunged toward the burning fabric, his hands reaching out as if to save the garments. Sophia seized the moment, grabbing Rebecca's dress and running for the exit. The whispers in the air turned to anguished wails as the flames devoured the studio. Outside, she collapsed on the pavement, clutching the dress to her chest. The fire roared behind her, the inferno casting long shadows. Weeks later, Sophia sat in her apartment, the rescued dress hanging in her closet. She had tried to move on, but the whispers hadn't stopped. Some nights, she thought she saw Rebecca's reflection in the mirror, watching her with sad, silent eyes. One evening, as she reached for the dress, she swore at sight